past hour or so, we're reaching, this is the coldest time of the morning. Typically, within 20 minutes of sunrise, you usually find your coldest temperatures.
We were talking about waves of sympathy. What about real waves? There's been some big ones. You've got swells of sort of 11 metres across the Cook Strait. They disrupted the ferries. Why the big waves, Chris?
Yeah, so those numbers are maximum waves. So typically a maximum wave can be about twice the size of what's called the significant wave height. Basically, the significant wave height is the average one-third of the highest waves, not to give our listeners too much of a science lesson. So why the big waves? It's because there's three things that go into a wave, at least the size of a wave. It's the wind speed, it's the fetch, that is the distance across water the wind is blowing, and it's the wind direction. Typically, we don't want winds to shift around too much, no more than 30 degrees. So think of a circle that's 360 degrees. That's how we measure wind, by using degrees. And if it stays within 30 degrees, the wind is pretty high, and there's a lot of water for that wind to blow across. Waves can really grow. And we had that. We had high pressure over the Tasman. Why does that go into causing waves? How does a high pressure, bear with me, a low pressure well east and south of the country? This is over the weekend, and that really directed a strong south-southwest wind. Those two weather systems, the high over the Tasman, the low well to the east and south, created what's called a pressure gradient. It's the big Monday morning term. That means change in air pressure over distance. Imagine putting your thumb over a garden hose. You have the water flowing now, but now you've decreased the area for that water to flow, so it has to accelerate. That's the same thing with the air, and that strong wind, because of the pressure gradient, it produced the big waves. So that is the big reason why. And in the ocean, the deep ocean, where there's not a lot of land to obstruct wave growth, you can get some really big waves in the Southern Ocean, no doubt about it.
Yeah, you had one. We won't spend long on this because I think we're talking about it later in the program. You had nearly a 20-metre wave that buoy recorded in the Southern Ocean. It looked pretty dramatic.
Yeah, when you have a lot of open water and a lot of high wind, those waves will get pretty strong. And that, climatologically speaking, is an area where there is a lot of wind. So it's a big number, but I think I wouldn't be surprised as we go into the future with that buoy there that we hear some more big numbers, because we have something there. When I say we, the weather community, the ocean community, has something there to actually sample the data and actually see what's going on.
Yeah. Thanks, Chris. Chris Brandolino from Niue, 7:24.
Well, two former Transport Ministry workers have, for the first time, spoken out about how they were forced out of their jobs after raising the alarm about the fraudster Joanne Harrison. The two whistleblowers say they alerted senior managers to fake invoices and dubious travel, but they were then targeted in a restructuring Harrison was involved in. They say the then Chief Executive Martin Matthews was repeatedly warned about Harrison's behaviour over 3 years, and they can't understand why it went on for so long. Our political reporter Benedict Collins has been speaking exclusively to the whistleblowers. He's with us now in the Wellington studio. Benedict, good morning to you. Now, these two former Transport Ministry employees, they believe they lost their jobs because they raised concerns about Joanne Harrison. So can you give us details about these specific concerns that they did raise?
Yes, good morning. So what we know, what they've told us is they became very suspicious that Joanne Harrison was bringing in, submitted a fake invoice regarding a company called Mazarine Associates. Now, they said this invoice had no email on it, no phone number on it, no address, just really, really unprofessional. And they said, look, they basically brought this up in team meetings. They alerted managers to it. They just thought it was really, really off. Now, one of the whistleblowers that we've spoken to also went and spoke to Joanne Harrison's right-hand man or PA and said, "Hey, do you know what Mazarine Associates does for the ministry? You know, what sort of work they do?" This associate had no idea whatsoever. Now, the other whistleblower we've spoken to was also concerned about the fake invoices, but she said she was also very worried about travel that Joanne Harrison was taking while she was a senior manager at the Ministry of Transport, and that included a trip to the United Kingdom for a conference. Now, the whistleblower basically didn't have enough details about this conference, so went digging into it and found that the conference had already been cancelled well before Joanne Harrison went on the trip. So they went and alerted Martin Matthews' office to this as well.
OK, and they believe that by raising these red flags, that actually led to them losing their jobs.
Oh, in their minds, they just have no doubt at all that raising these concerns then led to them losing their jobs. They said basically, Harrison's personality just totally changed. She went from being extremely friendly to them, like overly friendly, sort of almost unusual in a professional workplace, to being as cold as ice. And they said the timing of their redundancies just made no sense whatsoever. They came in December, the busiest time of year for their line of work, and they said, they were so busy, and on the 10th of December, 3 of the finance division were all restructured out, and temps came in. So they said, it just did not make sense. And they said, hey, at times when they were raising concerns about Harrison, they were told, look, your job, if the invoices come in and they're signed off, your job's to pay it, not to question things. But they said, they were really loyal to the ministry, and they were old school, and they were really conscious that this was taxpayer money.
Now, the Transport Ministry's chief executive initially ruled out any kind of investigation here into these claims. Last week, though, a change of mind happened. The employees, though, are still not happy. So what is this situation currently standing at?
Yeah, that's right. So back in March, the Labour MP, Sue Moroney, first raised these claims that whistleblowers have been forced out. Peter Mersey, the new chief executive, he said no. We're not going to have an inquiry, but that forced the State Services Commissioner, Peter Hughes, to write to him saying, hey, this raises a whole lot more issues about what's gone on here at the Transport Ministry. We need to find out what's gone on here. But the whistleblowers, they've got the terms of reference now. They think it's just too narrow. They felt the terms of reference were somewhat unprofessional, so they've written to Peter Hughes asking him to hold the inquiry.
OK, so as for the Transport Ministry, back when all of this was going on, does it appear that an opportunity was missed to stop Joanne Harrison's fraud, and that's way back in 2014?
Yep, that's right. So we knew back in 2014, basically shortly after Joanne Harrison was sentenced and convicted, the ministry released a whole lot of emails about the fraud. Now, the last few emails were really, really interesting. They had Lisa Nixon, she was the chief legal advisor, demanding answers from Joanne Harrison about a company called Sharp Design, saying, hey, you've got to provide information about what this company did. Now, Joanne Harrison then wrote to the chief executive at the time, Martin Matthews, who's now the Auditor General, urging him to close down the investigation. Now, once I'd seen that was the end of the email trail. I submitted under the OIA, asked what had come next, but I also interviewed Martin Matthews at that time. He said, absolutely, I did not close this investigation down. I made sure that Joanne Harrison had to keep complying with the chief legal advisor. Now, last week, I've got the OIA back, and what it shows is the very next email is that Martin Matthews wrote back to the chief legal advisor and said, I have decided not to pursue this matter any further. He said it was a difficult decision because he wasn't happy with the transparency, but he said if he questioned Joanne Harrison further about this, it would show a lack of trust.
Appreciate your time. Benedict Collins, our political reporter there. It's now just approaching 7:30, but also in the studio with us this morning in Wellington is the Prime Minister, Bill English. Good morning.
Good morning.
Now, we would like to talk to you briefly about the TPP, but you did hear what Benedict was talking about there. Do you have, as a result of what you're hearing here from OIAs and the like, do you have full confidence in the Auditor General, Martin Matthews?
Well, remember, the Auditor General is not the government's man, he's Parliament's man. And he's Parliament's man because he has to independently investigate the government. So it'd actually be quite inappropriate for the Prime Minister, not me or any previous Prime Minister, to be casting opinions about the Auditor General.
But do you think there should be some investigation done into him, considering this information that's coming to light?
Well, I think we need to think about this in, I think, two fairly separate bits. One is around the employees, and it would be absolutely proper for the State Services Commission to pick up on any new information about unfair treatment or misjudgments or whatever occurring within the public service. And it sounds from what Benedict said that the State Services Commissioner is involved in this. The other part of it is that Parliament, under the Speaker, with a committee of MPs, appoints the Auditor General. Now, the Speaker said in the last few days that the Serious Fraud Office briefed that appointment committee about the offending and the nature of it around the time of the appointment of the Auditor General. So it's really up to Parliament and the Speaker to decide about whether they are satisfied with the process they went through, which sounds thorough. but that's a separate matter from the investigation that, or investigating any new allegations such as the ones we've heard this morning.
Is there something that Parliament needs to take a look at again? Because it would seem that almost every day goes by and some more information begins to come out about this case.
Well, Parliament will have to make that decision because the Auditor-General is appointed strictly independently from government. But it is, I think, also important that the State Services Commissioner is looking into any new information about actions that should have been taken or unfair treatment of public employees. Does
it sound to you like perhaps this investigation should be run independently of the Transport Ministry? And this is something that I know you're saying the State Services Commissioner is involved in, but is this something actually that needs to be looked at more broadly and with an independent eye?
Well, the State Services Commissioner's job is to oversee the standards of the public service independent of any particular agency, and I think you would need to see that whether his process would need to be pretty unsatisfactory or fall short or whatever. But it's pretty important that if people are in the position of whistleblowing, that all the protections apply to that and that it's thoroughly looked into.
Okay, let's briefly talk also about the TPP. You're just back from Japan over the weekend, I think, and the economic gain you've been talking about with the TPP, or TPP 11 as it is now. Are you able to give figures and put figures around exactly what the gain is going to be without the United States?
Well, the initial savings of tariffs are around 200 million, and if I give an example of that, we came across in Japan. The Australian beef sold into Japan has a significantly lower tariff than New Zealand beef, so you would get a reduction to the Australian level, which levels the playing field. But if there's no change, that's a threat to the New Zealand market, the Japanese market for New Zealand beef, and in the long run, that will affect jobs and incomes, particularly in our region. So. I think the other thing to keep in mind here is the lesson from the Chinese free trade agreement is that you can get much bigger benefits than you actually thought at the start.
Okay, so you're saying even though the US was seen very much as the big prize out of the TPP, even though they're not in it, this is still going to be a win for New Zealand?
Yes, and for the region. So we get benefits, not as large as if the US was in. That was the point of going to the trouble of negotiating with them. But I think alongside that, there's the strategic benefit that at a time when there's instability in the Asia-Pacific, the idea that 11 countries with the leadership of Japan, who have not normally taken leadership, and particularly in trade, if we can get an agreement together, with New Zealand doing a lot of the work, Japan showing a leadership, then that would benefit the region and the economic integration of it. So we're not quite so dependent on whether the US joins up or not.
Considering the US is not in it at this stage, I know the door is being left open, so further down the line they could rejoin back into the TPP. But are there particular areas of the economy that will still see as big a win out of the TPP as they ever were? Likewise, are there other areas that won't see as much advantage?
In the absence of the US? Well, look, I wouldn't want to comment in a whole lot of detail, but generally, for our agricultural products, it's been difficult to get a good deal for access, for instance, to the Japanese market. So the countries that were tougher to negotiate with are still in. That's Canada and Japan. So there would have been bigger benefits with the US, there's no doubt about that.
It's a different beast now. So are you going to have to go back to Parliament?
Look, that would depend on whether the content of the agreement changed significantly. That's the advice I have.
Is it not a big enough change just in itself that the US, the biggest individual partner of this, is pulling out?
My advice is that that's not necessarily the case. It would only involve some technical changes in accession to the agreement. But I think the issue is whether the other parties, regardless of whether we're required to go back to Parliament, whether the other political parties support it or not. They've been conspicuous by their silence. But we believe it's worth New Zealand for both the immediate trade and the longer-term strategic benefits for us to pursue this agreement. I don't know what the view of Parliament is. I suspect mostly that the opposition parties are opposed to it.
After the election then, I heard you saying over the weekend that you didn't think it was going to be likely that this would be able to be passed before the election. Do you have any worries about whether this will continue on, that this will get passed, irrespective of the makeup of the government after the election?
Look, that's something that the election will deal with on its own, and it probably won't hinge on the TPP. But it does raise the broader argument where we've got a budget this week where everyone, all the other parties want to bid up to distribute the surplus in their favoured way, but don't support the work it takes to generate the economic activity, which then generates the surpluses.
But if National were to get in and to be the main partner in a government after the election, even if you're with New Zealand First, do you think you'll still be able to get TPP across the line?
Well, we would certainly be arguing for it, and if we can get an agreement where there isn't a renegotiation of the content of it, it may not need a further parliamentary vote beyond what it's already had.
Appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming into the studio this morning. That's the Prime Minister, Bill English, at 23 minutes to 8.
And coming up before 8 on Morning Report, we speak